Welcome back to part 3, The Road to Revolution. So we were talking about all of those things that the British had done leading up to the Revolutionary War. We finished talking about the Townshend Tea Act in 1767, where they had placed an external tax on customs duties on specific things like glass, lead, paint, silk, paper, etc. So the colonists are starting to get upset by all of this, and so they start to get organized in their opposition to these acts. John Dickinson challenged the distinction between the right to levy taxes for the purpose of generating revenue, and he argued that that was not within the rights of the British Parliament, that was actually a right of local governments and those colonial legislatures. So he writes that in his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. This motivates the Massachusetts Circular Letter that then is sort of repeated by other colonial legislatures that had similar arguments. And in this Massachusetts Circular Letter in 1768, the Massachusetts legislature, urged by Sam Adams and James Otis, supported Dickinson's arguments and called for other colonies to pass petitions calling for Parliament to repeal these unfair acts. Threatened to dissolve that legislature, they continued to circulate the letter, even though Parliament threatened to dissolve the Massachusetts legislature, which ultimately was, as well as the Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, and South Carolina legislature for doing similar actions. In 1767, New York's legislature was suspended for failure to comply with a quartering act, and tea became smuggled through to the U.S. And people were buying illegal smuggled tea. And then to enforce the law, the Brits had to send more troops to America, which you can sense is probably not going to go over well. And in fact, they insisted that the colonists pay for those troops to be there as well. And so again, the colonists started to see this as being very offensive to their individual rights and liberties. So we're getting to the Boston Massacre, which some people say are the first shots fired of the Revolution. You have the peaceful arrival of troops in Boston, which arouse the colonists in the Boston area. Colonists were fearful of standing armies, and they believed Britain sought to suppress colonial liberties. And on the evening of Wednesday, March 5th in 1770, a crowd of about 60 townspeople in Boston were harassing some 10 redcoats, not even very many guys. One got hit in the head, one got hit by a club, people were throwing rocks, that kind of stuff. And without orders, but heavily provoked, these redcoats opened fire, wounding or killing 11, quote, innocent civilians, including Crispus Attucks, who was the leader of the mob, according to some eyewitnesses. Crispus Attucks was a mulatto merchant seaman. He was the first to die in the Revolution and the alleged leader of the unruly mob. Word of the massacre quickly spread throughout the colonies, and colonial propagandists grossly exaggerated the event, and only 2 redcoats eventually got prosecuted. Colonists used the word massacre so that they would rally support, and you can see in this cartoon here, as it appeared in papers, the names of the fallen colonials. Here you have some of the propaganda that was used to fire up colonists, anti-British propaganda, with obviously the colonists down here in the corner with blood pouring out and the redcoats firing at will. This was actually published and printed by Paul Revere. Nope, I take that back. Yeah, Paul Revere. And published. It was a masterpiece of anti-British propaganda that inflamed American sentiments. So Paul Revere was really good at rounding all of these sorts of things up. Then you have the Townshend Acts actually get repealed. Lord North, bowing to pressure, got Parliament to repeal the act in 1770. Because those non-importation agreements, less because of the objections of the colonists, but because those non-importation agreements were actually hurting British manufacturers economically. They then maintained a 3 pence tax on tea to demonstrate Parliament's right to tax, and they still tax tea. That tax tea still cost less than the smuggled tea that colonists were drinking. Half the troops in Boston were removed, and it did improve relations until 1773. Then in 1771, you have the Gaspee Incident. A British warship ran aground near Rhode Island as they were pursuing smugglers, and the Sons of Liberty, dressed as Indians, and you can kind of see where this might be heading us, climbed aboard, took the crew off the ship, and set the ship on fire. The commander of the ship was wounded, and the Gaspee Commission was created by Lord Hillsborough to seek retribution, but he could not find the guilty parties. Well, of course, because they were disguised as Indians. And he would have sent them back to England for trial. They wouldn't have had their trial here in the United States. You then have the committees of correspondence, who start to organize even more, after their colonial legislatures had been disbanded. You had colonial discontent that was continuing as the British redoubled their efforts to enforce the navigation laws. Samuel Adams and Paul Revere used propaganda to whip up colonial resentment. And Adams organized local committees of correspondence in Massachusetts. In November 1772, their chief function was to spread propaganda and info by interchanging letters in order to keep opposition to British policy alive. So this is kind of like early social networking. Intercolonial committees of correspondence emerged, and these intercolonial groups evolved directly into America's first congresses. In 1773, the British don't let up. They passed the Tea Act. This grants the British East India Company a monopoly of American tea trade. At that time, the British East India Company had 17 million pounds of unsold tea and was facing bankruptcy. It was one of Britain's largest corporations. And so this is essentially a big corporate bailout, similar to what we did here in the United States with auto dealerships and auto manufacturers. It would have cost the British government huge amounts of revenue to let that company fail, and the price of tea would have been lower than existing prices even with the tax. So the British decided to start taxing it to help bolster this company, and the British decided to sell this tea to the Americans, but the Americans were suspicious and felt it was a shabby attempt to trick Americans into the bait of cheaper tea and to pay taxes that they didn't vote for. As a result, you get the Boston Tea Party in December 16th, 1773. The Sons of Liberty, once again dressed as Indians, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor, smashed 342 chests open, and dumped the tea into the harbor. People in Annapolis did the same thing and burned the ships to the ground, or to the water. And the reaction was varied from approval to outrage to disapproval. So here you can see you have the Sons of Liberty dressed as Indians dumping tea into the harbor. In 1774, Parliament passes the Intolerable Acts, also known as the Coercive Acts, or sometimes called the Repressive Acts, and they were designed specifically to punish Boston for their unruly acts at the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Port Act said that the harbor should remain closed until damages were paid and law and order was restored. Massachusetts' charter was revoked, and the king had power to appoint the governor's council, not the local assembly. It forbade town meetings except for the election of town officials. This means that you don't have the right to peaceably assemble, and you can start to see the Constitution picks up some of these rights. That is a First Amendment right now because the colonists felt violated. Trials were moved to England, and that meant that trials would be unfair and you would not be tried by a jury of your peers. Again, something that appears later in the U.S. Constitution. You also had the Quartering Act, which required troops to be on the ground in Boston and housed in people's homes. Third Amendment to the Constitution. And then the Quebec Act, which essentially granted French Canada the right to practice Catholicism. The First Continental Congress then meets in Philadelphia in the fall of 1774 to discuss the problems that were occurring. Delegates included Sam Adams, John Adams, George Washington, and Patrick Henry. They came up with a list of grievances which were ignored in Parliament. Georgia didn't have any representation at the First Continental Congress. and they came up with a Declaration of Rights. They also passed the Suffolk Resolves, which denounced the intolerable acts, urged colonists to organize a militia for defense purposes, called on colonies to suspend all trade with the rest of the British Empire, and urged citizens not to pay their taxes. The most significant action of this Congress called for the complete boycott of British goods, non-importation, non-exportation, and non-consumption of British goods. Congress restated allegiance to the king and no desire to be independent. They merely wanted their grievances redressed, meaning they wanted to be listened to, they wanted to be heard, and they wanted things fixed. That leads us to the shot heard round the world at Lexington and Concord. Parliament ordered General Gage, the new governor of Massachusetts, to arrest the leaders of the rebellion and prepare for military action. Gage sought to prevent bloodshed by disarming the local militia, taking their guns. Hence, you have the Second Amendment that comes later. In order to maintain a well-ordered militia, we have the right to own guns. Gage sought to prevent bloodshed, again by disarming that militia, and in April of 1875, 700 British redcoats sent secretly to nearby Lexington and Concord to seize gunpowder and arrest John Adams and John Hancock. Paul Revere and William Dawes warned the militia, who at this point are being called the Minutemen. The Battle of Lexington and Concord began when the Minutemen refused to disperse on the Lexington Green, and shots were fired. 8 Americans were killed, 10 were wounded, but we still don't know who fired the first shot. Redcoats continued on to the town of Concord, 6 miles away. At Concord, British was forced to retreat by American reinforcements. The militia picked off British soldiers as they retreated to Boston. So this is the era when, particularly the British, were marching in line formations, and the American colonists start using more guerrilla warfare tactics, and were not lining in these marching army formations because they weren't true armies. By the day's end, at Concord, 273 British casualties, and there were 273 British casualties and 95 American casualties. The Minutemen encamped outside the city and laid siege to the city of Boston. So you can see this is an image of the Green in Lexington. So, in summary, what's this all mean? Throughout this time period, the Brits thought that the colonists should pay their war debt for the French and Indian War, and they passed acts to generate revenue to pay for those debts. They just wanted the Americans to pay their fair share. Americans saw themselves as unique from England and believed that the taxes, tariffs, and duties were unjust. They called it taxation without representation. They felt that Parliament had no right to tax them since they did not have representation in that Parliament. Colonists openly resisted British laws through boycotts, the Tea Party, committees of correspondence, and the use of propaganda. British troops sent troops to get the colonists to behave. They quartered troops in people's homes, they had unfair trials, and they banned public meetings. All of those actions later lead the colonists to be very specific in the U.S. Constitution about our rights with regards to those issues. And it turns into the Bill of Rights. Colonists petition for a redress of grievances. All of these arguments, these grievances, these griefs, these gripes, get ignored by Parliament and the King. And therefore, that leads us to shots fired at the Boston Massacre and Lexington and Concord. That has been your road to revolution.
The American colonists viewed the presence of British troops in America with favor as long as the threat of French or Indian attack remained. After the French and Indian Wars, however, the Americans saw no need for continued British military presence. On the other hand, from the British point of view, the need was increasing. There was the newly gained territory to protect. There was no organized government west of the Alleghenies, and there was a need for the Americans to share in the increased cost of governing the colonies. The British closed the West to settlement, levied taxes and duties, enforced the collection of these taxes, and stationed troops in New York and Boston. The presence of these troops was distasteful to the Americans, who were more interested in freedom than in independence from England.